Have you seen the Dogman? Legend speaks of a 7-foot-tall creature that has blue or amber-colored eyes, walks on 2 legs, has the chest of a man and the head of a dog. It was first reported in Michigan in the late 1800s in Wexford County, where 2 lumberjacks saw a creature which they described as having a man's body and a dog's head. Ever since then, the Dogman has been spotted all across the Midwestern United States. These are a few of those encounters. This first story was sent to me by a viewer. She asked to remain anonymous due to fear of not being believed. So for the purpose of this video, we'll call her Janis. It was the winter of 2010, and Janis was feeding her livestock in her family's barn, as she did every morning. It was a typical morning for Janis, except for the bitter cold. The sun had not yet risen, and for whatever reason, it was far colder than she had expected it to be. Despite all this, she barreled through her chores as fast as possible before school that day. Before she was able to finish, the animals in the barn began to act strangely. They retreated into their stalls, backing away from Janis, and became unusually silent. In fact, everything became silent. The birds outside, who usually became active just before sunrise, were painfully absent. That's when she heard it. The gargling howl. She described it like a dog's howl, but more bassy and guttural, like a wet, choking bark. It was unlike anything Janis had ever heard. She said she just sat there, frozen in the barn for some time. She can't remember quite how long, listening for the creature again. She heard nothing. By this time, Janis could make out the sun peeking out between the boards of the barn, and figured it was safe to return to the house, which was about 40 yards away from the barn. She stepped out of the barn and latched the door. That's when she heard the large branch snap to the left of her. She saw the branch fall out of the corner of her eye. The tree was large, about 4 feet in diameter, and was about 20 yards away from her. The branch seemed to come from high up in the tree. That's when she saw the steam. It was billowing out from behind the trunk, in the rhythm of a breath. She told me that she was cold that morning, but seeing the breath from behind the tree froze her where she stood. After what was only really a few seconds, but felt like a lifetime, Janis made a break for the house. She didn't even bother to unhook the pasture gate, and instead flung herself over it. She scrambled up and out of the snow and made it to her house, to the alarm of her father. She explained to her father what had happened, and he retrieved his shotgun. They cautiously went back out onto the porch. That's when they saw the shape, out in the side pasture. It was out on the tree line, about 200 yards away, on the other end of the field. She described it as large, walking on its hind legs, with a dog-like head and pointed ears. She said she could not make out any more details, and that the creature was more silhouetted against the forest due to the sunlight just coming over the horizon. She said it looked like it was sniffing the air, and dropped down on all fours and ran into the trees. She told me anytime she tried to talk about it with her dad or other family members, they refused to talk about it. Her dad told her that sometimes it's best just to put some things behind them, and that she should just leave it alone. Janis told me she had never seen her dad as scared as he was that morning. She no longer goes out to the barn in the dark. The second story comes to me from Thomas Mallory of northern Indiana. Thomas describes a camping trip with his friends when he was in college. It was an annual trip in late October, and they had all been looking forward to it all year long. One of his friend's dad owned a small cabin out in the woods, and they would all go up for a 4-day weekend and hunt, fish, drink, and hang out around the campfire. This weekend trip had been a successful one so far, and the boys had shot a buck in the early morning hours. The only problem was, they couldn't find it. They tracked the blood trail for about 20 minutes before the trail just stopped. Thomas described the scene as being the most confusing he had ever seen while hunting, before or since. It was as though the buck just disappeared. One minute the blood trail was there, the next it just ended in a pool of blood under a tree. The boys searched but never found the buck. Discouraged, they returned to the cabin. As it was the last full day of the trip, the boys spent the day cleaning the area and the cabin and packing up their cars. That night, they cooked out under the stars and went to bed early, as they had a long drive the next day. About 2:45 in the morning, Tomas described being woken up by a strange sound coming from outside. It was a low, gargling noise. Tomas described it as a cross between the sound of geese and a human mumbling at a high-pitched whine. He told me it sent shivers down his spine. He wasn't the only one woken up by the sound. Within short order, the rest of the boys were up, looking out the window for the source of the sound. No one could see anything. That's when whatever it was started attacking the cabin. For 2 hours, the boys huddled inside the cabin as something or someone pounded the cabin from all sides. There would be the sound of a large thud, as if something was thrown on the outside wall of the cabin. It would be quiet for a while, and then it would happen again, Tomas explained to me. We all had guns. I think whatever it was knew it. It stayed just far enough away so we could never get a good look at it or get it in our sights. Whatever it was smart, Tomas continued. The next morning, the boys discovered what had been thrown at the cabin. It was what was left of the buck they had shot the day before. The buck had been ripped apart and its pieces thrown at the cabin in the dead of night. I don't know if it was mad at us for shooting the buck, or if we got in its way while it was hunting the buck. Whatever it was not happy with us, Tomas told me. With the help of the light of day, the boys found strange dog-like tracks all around the house. He described them as being unusually large, larger than any dog or wolf print he'd ever seen. Tomas explained to me that the forest he and his friends were hunting in once belonged to the Shawnee people, and he believed the boys and he had somehow trespassed or insulted some spirit of the area. I tend to agree with him. That was the last hunting trip Tomas and his friends ever went on together. The boys just couldn't get over what happened that night. His friend's dad sold the land a few years later. Tomas says he still hunts, but he never spends the night out there in the woods. He always comes back before dark, just in case. Our last story comes from a user named Hyper8 in New England. Hyper described an evening where they were sitting on their back porch in the late fall. It had just entered that time of year where the late-night cold would creep deep into your bones, and Hyper had just brewed a cup of tea to fight the encroaching chill. As they stepped back out onto the porch, they were hit by a strange, distinct smell. Hyper described it as part old meat and a dirty, earthy copper smell. The smell was strong and heavy and seemed to come out of nowhere. That's when the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. Hyper had the indescribable feeling of being watched. Their house sat on a large hill, and below them was a field, with trees about 100 yards away. There were also power lines that traveled down that hill, all the way to the horizon. The area below the lines were cleared of trees and brush. In essence, there was a clear path under the power lines, all the way down their hill and up the next. Down that path, about halfway down the hill, Hyper saw the dark figure. It was a large, dark shadow, hunched over at the base of one of the power lines. Hyper had seen numerous deer and other wildlife at night and in the early mornings in the area before, but this was somehow different. The creature was large, very large. At first they thought it might be a bear, but they'd never seen one in this area before. That's when it stood on 2 feet. They guessed the creature to be over 6 feet, or 2 meters tall. It also seemed to notice it was being watched, and Hyper described a tense moment where they felt like they were both just staring at each other. Hyper distinctly remembers seeing that it had 2 pointy ears on the top of his head, and that they moved like an animal trying to locate a sound off in the distance. After what seemed to be a lifetime, the animal bolted away to the tree line, back on all fours. Hyper quickly made a run for inside the house, bolting the door behind them, dropping and breaking their favorite tea mug in the process. Hyper rationalized it as maybe being a large dog or bear, but never really believed that. 3 weeks later, Hyper was back out on their porch when they smelled the horrible odor again. But this time, it was stronger. Some people run when they get scared. Some people fight. But Hyper froze in place when the smell returned, locked in place in fear. They described it as almost paranormal. Every cell of their body was screaming to run, but they just couldn't. Hyper scanned the tree line with their eyes in search of the shape they knew was out there, somewhere, watching. They never saw it. After a few minutes, Hyper gained control of their body and went inside. To this day, they have never seen the creature again, but the smell has come back 3 times. It's been 3 years. Is the Dogman real? Is there a 7-foot-tall, wolf-like man out there hunting? Or is it just our imaginations? Are we just afraid of what could be out there? Some memory of a creature that hunted our ancestors thousands of years ago? I'm not too sure. People are seeing something out there in the woods, and it's big, strong, and apparently hungry. So next time you're out camping, keep an eye out, your ears open, and your nose to the ground for the Dogman. Just might save your life. This is Broadcaster 7. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to receive alerts when I release new videos every week. And as always, are you programmed to receive the night signal?